Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William B., Brian, Christina, Sarah, William H., Augustus, Keanu, and Judy at the Alexandria level. We have Doppo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, Alex, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Frederick the Great, Geoffrey the Great, and Jim the Great. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.
Now, what can you tell us about the background to this extremely important and fascinating document, the Septuagint? For a start, I'd like to know, where does the name come from?
Well, the Septuagint, it's pretty much like everything. It's a mixture of myth and history and gets rolled up into legend. There's a great quote on that, and it's from a children's video series about history and legend, and I cannot think of it at the moment, but it's so true that we need our legends. And I think when you try and boil things down to just pure history or just pure myth, you kind of miss something from the legendary quality. But the legend of the Septuagint is pretty interesting, and I think it says a lot about what's going on at that time. Now, the original translation, most scholars think, was just the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, which sounds very Greek-y, or the Torah. But some of the original claims say that it was the whole Old Testament was translated.
Oh, okay.
Now, there's this letter, really everything that scholars know about the legend and really quite a bit of the history of the Septuagint, of why somebody would go ahead and translate it, is from something called the Letter of Aristeas to his brother Philocrates. And the letter is pretty clearly pseudo-epigraphal. It's supposed to be by some Greek official who lived during the time of the translation process, but the letter can't be dated any earlier really than 100 years later. There's it's just filled with historical anachronisms that don't place it anywhere near the real time. And more than likely, the letter was probably written by an Alexandrian Jew living much later. Aristeas would have been, your bog standard Greek pagan or whatever. But it's almost certainly written by an Alexandrian Jew living a little much later than the time, at least 100 years. And so the basic story is as follows. There was Ptolemy the Second Philadelphus, and he was
I have heard that initial sound was pronounced exactly as you did it the first time, Ptolemy. So you go to say a p, but then you say a t. Now, to me, it's a really ugly and difficult thing to say, but I'm just thought I'd mention.
So, man, maybe we'll run with it. But he was the son of Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy. I'm going with it. Ptolemy I Soter, who was in this. So we'll get into, but so he was born, this Ptolemy II was born around 308 BC and he died in 246 BC. His dad, the Ptolemy I, took Egypt during the Great War of the Successors after Alexander the Great passed on. And that the son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, he's the one who got the whole Library of Alexandria project going. Now, supposedly, he wanted all the important texts from all over his empire and really the world in his library. So
good on him.
Yeah. So, hey, why not get the sacred holy text of the Jews, who were an important group in some of the outer fringes of his, I don't know if empire is the right word, or country's probably not the right word. Lands, maybe you might want to call it. Kingdom, domain. And so according to the letter of Aristeas, Ptolemy asked the high priest Eleazar of the Temple of Jerusalem to send him scholars to translate the sacred religious texts of the Jews into the common Greek of that time. And guess what? Eleazar was delighted to help.
Great idea, Your Majesty.
Yeah.
Great idea.
I was just waiting for this to happen.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So he sent 72 of his best scholars to Alexandria. Hence, that's where we get the term Septuagint, or the translation of the 70, which was technically the 72. But the Septuagint, I'm trying to think of what the 72, it probably is a total mouthful. So maybe they just went with Septuagint.
Now, I have a question. What does the "jint" mean in Septuagint? What word is it from?
I saw something. Oh, my goodness. I cannot remember what the breakdown was. It was something in Greek, and it wasn't terribly interesting. That's why I didn't write it down. I think it was just like a grammar thing or something. It wasn't. Or now I'll have to look that up. We'll add that in later. That's going to drive me nuts because I just read that too. Steve here, I have just a quick addendum to what I just said. The Septuagint, the word Septuagint, actually is a late Latin name given to this translation. Septuaginta simply means the word 70, or the number 70 in Latin. The early Greek Jew or user of the translation just simply called it the Greek translation of the 70, or something to that effect. The Greeks just called the translation 70 in their own language. You can see artifacts of the word Septuaginta in modern Latin-based Romance languages like setenta in Spanish, and in Romanian, the j sound in Septuaginta even remains. I apologize for my lack of Greek and knowledge and understanding. I'm actually considering taking a course in both Latin and Hellenistic Greek if there was only more time. But back to the program. But so the 72 were supposed to be 6 scholars from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. So 6 times 12 equals 72. And one thing that I wanted to ask you about here was, wasn't at this time there really wasn't 12 tribes anymore? Steve here again. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Chris Mowery's Vlogging Through History and many other great podcasts. Go over to Parthenon Podcast to learn more. And now here's a quick word from our sponsors.
Nah, long gone, I would have thought. For example, the tribe of Reuben had ceased to exist even before, I think, the Babylonian exile. It had been swallowed up by Simeon, or the other way around. I can't remember which. And I think if modern Jews had a concept of tribes, it was pretty vague. And it might have been up there with sort of, like Daughters of the Revolution. Oh, yeah, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was a something. Or in Britain, oh, yes, I'm the descendant of Charles II's mistress, so-and-so. I think it was pretty vague.
So I think you can see these numbers, 72, 12, etc. They're all, and then the whole 12 tribes of Israel thing is really trying to make a theological impact, which that probably gives us, as we're moving forward, that they're making a theological point that the Greeks wouldn't have had any idea about or probably really cared. So that gives us a little hint of where the letter of Aristeas is going. Now, these 72 translators were broken up into teams of 2 scholars, and then the 72 were sent to the island of the famous Pharos Lighthouse. So really, basically into the outskirts of town. And then each of those 2 teams of scholars was locked up into their own cells to develop their own translation. And after 72 days, the 36 teams emerged from their cells, and each team's translation was exactly the same as all the other teams. And
it's a miracle. It's a miracle.
Exactly. And the Septuagint was born, which the Septuagint, if you see it in shorthand and writing, is often referred to as the LXX, or the Roman numerals of 70. And so that at that point, we get the idea that this document, the Septuagint, was inspired by God through the Holy Spirit. It's taken on through this legend or history or whatever you want to call it, depending on, what your particular take is, that it's an inspired document, that it just wasn't. Because if you wanted to think about it, that's probably a pretty bright idea. If you want to get a clean translation, break them up into teams so that they don't start to get an institutional bias towards one form of translation or another. It might have been difficult if they needed source documentation. And presumably all of these guys spoke Greek and Hebrew perfectly.
As a complete sidebar, Steve, there is this is just a reminder, there's a fairly modern French film called The Translators, where a guy who represents a very famous author has received the author's latest manuscript, and he gets together a whole bunch of translators, locks them in a castle, and has them translate the book into different languages. And he locks them in the castle because he doesn't want, any stuff to get out into the publishing world. So it's just occurred to me that must have been inspired by the Septuagint.
The movie sounds really familiar too. I think we may have started watching it and I fell asleep during it.
Well, that's possible. It's not a fast movie, and a lot of people die in it. It's sort of a murder mystery.
And that whole idea of trying to maybe iron out biases. There's been some recent translations of the Bible that were criticized for being too literal, or that the team that they put together was too skewed in a certain direction. And that when they got together, they took certain passages and translated them in really ways that they had never been translated in before. But they're trying to come up with a clean translation here into a language that it had really never been translated into before. So it's a really interesting process. And I would think it wouldn't be outside of the realm of possibilities that you would want to get that many people, that you would want to have a pretty large team translating something like this.
Yeah, you would. It'd be interesting to find out how big was the team that translated the King James Bible. I wonder how many people they had.
That could be another episode or another series, the King James version, because I think that has, I think some people say that has a little bit of inspiration to it.
Yeah, isn't there a whole movement, the King James movement, which says that the King James Bible is the only possible translation into English you can use because, yes, it has divine inspiration. Apparently they're quite vociferous about the fact.
Yeah, that's something to keep on the back burner because it is very similar.
Okay, well, who do you think the translators actually were? I mean, the legend is that these guys have come from Judea to Egypt. But is that likely?
It's probably much more likely that the original translators were Alexandrian Jews who they really would have been the ones who would have the language skills in both Greek and in Hebrew to make this possible. Now, there's three maybe consensus reasons on why Ptolemy might have invited this translation. You've got the letter of Aristeas reasoning that Ptolemy really wanted a copy for his Library of Alexandria project, and the librarians wanted copies of absolutely everything. And the Jews were an important religious minority for sure. Maybe Ptolemy was really that enlightened of a guy and loved learning so much that he wanted the Hebrew text translated. And maybe Ptolemy wanted the wisdom of the Hebrew text to build his own law code. I mean, none of that's really impossible.
I'd like to think it's the real explanation. I'd like to think highly of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, but there are other ideas, aren't there?
Another possible one is that the Greek Alexandrian Jews wanted a version of the sacred text in Greeks to raise their own text, the Hebrew text, to the high literary language of the day. And this would raise the cultural status of the Hellenized Jews of Alexandria to more of their, become more Greekified.
Yeah.
And then the third is possibly, I think this is maybe the most interesting one. It's practical reasons. You have these Hellenized Greek Jews. They wanted a version of the Old Testament, the Hebrew text, whatever you want to call it, in the language that they could actually understand. And maybe as a missionary tools, because we think of so often that Judaism isn't a proselytizing religion, but that's not the case. In the Second Temple period, we have God-fearers, the Gentiles who were leaning towards Judaism or who even converted. Then you have also, even inside of Judea, Palestine area, where you have Jews who very well may not have had a good understanding of liturgical Hebrew. Their first language was not liturgical Hebrew, it was Aramaic at the time. So the Greek might have been a language that the people were more apt to understand.
Just on the God-fearers, there's certainly a lot of evidence from both Hellenistic times and Roman time that, for example, that they're all called Ptolemy, which shows a distinct lack of imagination in naming children.
So then this makes me think, who was the original audience, the intended audience of this translation? And it was really Jews all over the ancient world. Many Jews, they lived in Egypt long before the Greeks conquered it. So they were thoroughly Egyptian. Yep. But then there was a really wide diaspora of Jews all over the Hellenistic world. And diaspora actually comes from a Greek word to mean scatter. And apparently in Hebrew, they would have been more likely to use the word galut or galut, meaning exile, as opposed to diaspora. And Josephus, he used a really interesting analogy of the model of Greek colonization, where Jerusalem and Judea, that's the patria or the home city. And the Greeks, they would have a home city that would go and send out people and they would colonize. And the places in Crimea that were Greek colonies, they had a home base that they kind of felt was their homeland in Greece. And even as far as Magna Graecia and Italy and Marseille and France, that they had a connection to a home city. And then, so in the Jewish context, the Jerusalem or Judea is the home city, and then the diaspora is colonies. But to go back into the Jewish theology, hopefully one day there would be a gathering of all Jews in Jerusalem in the homeland. But the Jews at this time, they lived in Egypt and Libya, which was two different parts, Cyrenaica and something else. And they lived in Cyprus. They lived in Syria, the Middle East, and the Levant, kind of outside of the core of Judea and the Galilee. Then they also lived outside of Egypt, Syria, and into Rome, Greece, Anatolia, and even beyond. And the Jews of the Heimat, you might call it, meaning Judea, Palestine, Galilee, were kind of different. They had a different vibe going, as the kids say. And then on top of that, you have the Jewish converts and the proselytes and the God-fearers, which are weird, and they're making things different. And then you have the Jews of Babylon, who really don't play at all into the Septuagint translation, but they'll indirectly come into the story later on, but they're different too. But the Jews all over the Hellenized world spoke Greek at least as a second language, even in Judea. And many of them, it's hard to say to put numbers on it, but it could have been a majority of them spoke Greek as their first language. And Greek may have really been the language that many Jews understood best in the developing synagogue system. The average Jew, even in Palestine, probably, as we said earlier, didn't have a practical understanding of Hebrew or liturgical Hebrew.
Yeah.
And like we said, again, most would have spoke Aramaic as their first language. So really, to wrap up the history, one really important fact is there's almost no examples of a barbarian, meaning a foreign, to the Greeks at least, foreign religious text, of being officially translated into Greek in this way is ever been recorded or found. That it's a pretty unusual thing that this document was translated into Greek. And so there's got to be more than just the story of the letter of Aristeas that Ptolemy was a great guy. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah. That never occurred to me, that this literary work is unique in that at least some Greek speakers thought, here's something from what they consider barbarian culture, but it's still worth preserving. I mean, the Greeks really put down anyone who didn't speak Greek, didn't they? Or wasn't native Greek in a sense. They were pretty snobby about their civilization.
And if you wanted to slide into that whole network, and I mean, there's so many things of, even in Jerusalem, where certain Jews wanted to build a gymnasium and a different, is it pronounced a boule, the town council? They wanted to set all that up.
Yeah.
And there were certain elements of the Jewish society that were not game for that. But if you wanted to raise yourself to be like Damascus and Antioch and Alexandria, you had to have these institutions, which speaking Greek was certainly one of them.
Absolutely. If you wanted to join the elites of the empire and make the big money, you really needed to speak Greek. I mean, I suppose your average Judean farmer can quite happily spend their whole lives in Aramaic. But, well, if you migrate to Egypt, if you're a Judean migrating to Egypt, you're not migrating there to start growing wheat or whatever. You're migrating there to join the mercantile classes, the merchants, educated and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
And they really, if you think about it, how close Judea is to Egypt, it's a sailing. It's a couple of days. I meant to check that website where you can basically Google Maps how it took to travel from one place to the next. But I mean, in the right conditions, it wasn't more than maybe a 3-day journey by sea. And if you had to walk it, it was only about 2 weeks.
Yeah, they're very close, and they had a very long connection. I mean, if you go right back to the book of Genesis, Abraham's family pops off to Egypt every so often, famous story of Joseph, etc. In fact, the Judeans, whenever times get rough in Canaan, Palestine, Judea, the first place they think of going to get out of the mess they're in is Egypt. When Babylon conquered them and Jeremiah was taken to Egypt. So a very close connection.
And I think we see this really, a lot of this got me thinking to so much of the things that Gil is talking about in his podcast, The Biblical Proportions, of how much the the Jews influenced the Greeks in Egypt and how much the Greeks influenced the Jews. I mean, you get a real synchronization of, and I won't put any words in Gil's mouth about that, but I think in my own understanding, I never really quite understood how much their cultures blended together. But then again, if we talk about Aramaic, that was the language brought in by the Chaldeans when they conquered, several centuries earlier.
Yeah, I mean, Aramaic was spoken all the way from the Mediterranean coast through to Mesopotamia, wasn't it? And it's still around today. I don't know how many speakers there are, but it's still around.
Yeah, and I mean, that shows how these things, the languages get rooted, but then when something new washes through, how many people in those areas, I mean, it's probably a pretty significant amount speak English.
All right, Steve. So the translators of this Hebrew text into Greek had a whole bunch of difficult problems before.
And they had really, whoever they were, but they had a really difficult problem. The Hebrew text, aka the Old Testament, it's packed with figurative language, poetic elements, word plays. I think certain books are written in an acrostic poem format. I mean, is it Genesis, or I can't remember what it was. But it's amazing.
I remember from our series on the prophets, some of the prophets are considered incredibly impenetrable.
Yeah.
Who's that one? The guy I hate.
Hosea?
Yeah, Hosea. That sounds like him. Yeah. Apparently his language is considered, in Hebrew, it's considered very difficult.
And then you pile on that with cultural literary tropes. And this one example always sticks out to me. I listened to a translation of the Spanish classic Don Quixote with my wife on a road trip. And so he's like the Shakespeare of Spanish, but even more so. But we're listening, and it's just a line after line of just this impenetrable mumbo jumbo. And we're looking at ourselves like, what the heck is this about? And then there's a footnote where the translator basically says that this whole thing made perfect sense in Spanish, but it'll make almost no sense in English, due to the difficulty of translating the section. And you think about so many different issues like this with translation. And then I was trying to think of a really good analogy to why Jews who probably speak Aramaic, maybe know a little bit of Hebrew as their liturgical language, would want something translated in Greek. And it may have just been that it was the closest thing. If you kind of, I'm using a lot of examples of Spanish, but take like in the US, when Latin as the liturgical language was the most common, or was the norm back in the 60s and before in the Catholic Church. If you were a Spanish speaker and the liturgical language is Latin, maybe you know a little bit of it, or you know nothing of it, but you probably aren't an expert in it. And you have the choice. Maybe there's not enough Spanish speakers in your community to have the gospel reading and the sermon done in Spanish. So you got to do the next best thing. You're not going to learn Latin. So you have it in English, which which people might have a much more of a grasp of than they would of learning liturgical Latin. And so I think that that's probably something of an analogy, that language is really complicated, and we're really just dipping into some of the complexities to set us up for the next couple of episodes that will get into some of the details of how things were translated, why things were translated, and how there's probably a real diversity of texts that explain that just simply more than just bumbling translation. I'm wondering, and it was always the feeling that I got from reading about the Septuagint, that the feeling of the consensus was that the Septuagint was an interesting thing, but it was a clumsy translation of the Hebrew.
Oh, okay.
Did you ever get that feeling?
I haven't come across anything like that, but that's, I don't know.
Or now here's the other thing, that people, and it goes back to that quote that we used about a Christian document, that people almost just assume that the Septuagint was a Christian document.
Oh, that's a point. Yeah.
It's something to think about going forward, is that I think some of these problems that people had with the Septuagint, especially even very early on, which we'll get into, of some of the even the earliest Christian thinkers had a problem with the Septuagint, is that they're all trying to reach back for the original take. And what's this, let's skip over the Septuagint, get to what the Hebrew is really talking about. But they might be trying to jump over the Septuagint to get into something that's not necessarily there.
Yeah.
And that's something that we'll definitely explore in future episodes, that jump over the Septuagint to get to this philosopher's stone of the original Hebrew manuscript or document. And it's just, you're expecting to unroll a scroll that says the original Hebrew, that wasn't something that actually was ever something that they were going to be able to attain.
Yeah.
All right. And with that, thank you so much, Garry, for joining us on this episode. And I'm definitely looking forward to future ones.
It's been a pleasure, Steve. And I'm looking forward to coming back for another session.